today. This is a special forum that we're having only for today, and I am really pleased to welcome someone who's become a new friend to me, Beverly Haberle. She is the Executive Director of the Council of Southeastern Pennsylvania, and Beverly has been working for decades on issues related to addiction and recovery for individuals and families. In fact, Beverly today has to leave right at 11:15 because she has a family who's in crisis, and so she will be with us and we'll have time with her, and then but she will need to be on her way. Coming in now, there are copies of her PowerPoint presentation, as well as information about all of the different services that the council provides. The Thompson Church, this also really launches one of our mission initiatives, which is an initiative on addiction awareness. There's a group of us who have been meeting for a couple months, and we are working very closely with Beverly and her associates in planning for this coming fall a 4-week addiction awareness class. We're partnering with Doylestown Presbyterian Church, Beverly's home church, and we're very excited that we'll be able to provide help for people in our community who are struggling with this issue. You may once have heard about a story of a coast along a very stormy edge of the sea, and boats would crash and people would drown all the time. Well, people who lived nearby realized that this was a problem, and they created a place to rescue people. And they made ships, and they had life preservers, and they did their best to rescue people who were in danger. As time went by, they built buildings, and with enough time passing, people stopped saving people who needed saving and spent all of their time in the rescue station thinking about past times where they saved people and past stories, but they stopped their business of helping others. Friends, that can happen in the church, but I'm grateful that we now have an opportunity to be out in the business of helping those who are in desperate need of help. Let me offer a brief prayer, and then I'll turn it over to Beverly. Let us pray. Lord, we thank you so much for the opportunity today to hear how you might use us. Lord, we say, here we are, send us. Thank you for Beverly. Thank you for the incredible staff at the council. Please bless them and be with them. We commend Beverly to your care. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you very much. And I am a lifelong Presbyterian, and I also happen to be a person in long-term recovery, which means that I haven't used alcohol or any other drugs for the past 45 years. So I also was a very young person in recovery. So a lot of what we are going to talk about today really revolves around, the potential and good news. That while there is a lot of really bad news out there, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening here in Bucks County and what's happening in the nation around addiction, there's also, a great deal of really good news around recovery. So just to get started, some of the things we're going to talk about is that addiction is a psychological, physical, and spiritual problem, and we're going to focus most of the time, the end of the program, on the spiritual nature of addiction and how churches can be helpful. We're going to talk about also sort of, some of the really important reasons that churches should be involved in this effort. With addiction being having a spiritual component in it, we can be very, very helpful. And I have shared with the group that for me, this is almost coming full circle. I began in this field almost 40 years ago with the Philadelphia Presbytery, looking at the role that churches could play in really strengthening addiction, recovery in the community. And so it has taken a long time, but things, sort of do eventually come in God's will and His time on how things should be happening. And so, I'm thrilled to be here, but we're going to talk about some of the barriers also that prohibit some of that progress for happening. So it is a very complex public health problem, and it is in every community. So, I have gone through in my lifetime in working in this field, people blaming everybody else and saying it's really over there, it's really over there. Well, I don't know of a community in this country that is not affected by addiction, and that also doesn't have some real strengths in that community that can be put together to really help support recovery. And that's where churches can play a really important role in that, and I think it's exciting that that churches are beginning to look at, you know, this as part of mission and as part of how they can really outreach and begin to change some things within the community. So I'm thrilled with all of that. So just to give you some statistics, so in 1999 and 2010, we have had a huge increase in prescription drugs. And that huge increase in prescription drugs is one of those things, the availability of prescription drugs is one of the things that has really escalated the issue around heroin. Because right now heroin happens to be much cheaper for people to access. Philadelphia happens to be the purest and the cheapest heroin in the country. So bordering Philadelphia gives us, you know, easy access, and there are many people and there are many efforts that are going on to try to really get a handle around this, you know, increase in prescription medication that's available and people who are being targeted for prescription medication. You mentioned that I'm about to go to an intervention when I leave here today for a young man who's 33, and 10 years ago he was put on prescription medication because of a sports injury that he had had. And that injury, with people trying to escalate and manage, his need for painkillers grew, as well as his the doctors trying to cut off his availability to it. So he was arrested last week for buying heroin in Philadelphia. And so it's a, you know, it's a real problem, but we need to look at some of the roots of that problem and where some of this is all coming from. Every day, more than 2,500 teenagers abuse prescription medication for the first time, so we have a continuing growing population. There's an average age thought in Bucks County that the first onset of use is between 9 and 11. Kids being accessed and exposed to some kind of mood-altering drug, whether it's alcohol or whatever, and there's a prevalence of really decriminalizing, but looking at marijuana as really not being a problem. So it's some kind, so that's kind of carried in that whole spectrum of mood-altering drugs. The overdoses have doubled, more than doubled in the past 5 years, with 2009 having 136 deaths and 272 in 2013 and 400 in 2014. One of the things that has occurred, which has been helpful, is the really assertive effort of putting Narcan available, and Narcan is the overdose reversal drug. So we now have 30 police departments here in Bucks County who have availability of Narcan. We've been working really hard to get it in the hands of all the EMTs and, you know, all of the ambulance services and all. And this year to date, there was 107 rescues of people's lives that were saved as a result of, so that's from January to now. There's been 107, so we're really hoping that those numbers go down this year. You know, of the 50% of the deaths, and this is what's, any death is terrible, but 50% of the deaths were under the age of 24. So we're losing a whole generation of people. And one of the things that is, it used to be looked at as mostly males. And there was a recent study in our 5-county area. We're having a huge insert of females. In fact, Chester County now, the females dying of overdose has overshadowed the males dying of overdose in that under 24 population. So there's a whole lot of reasons for that. Some of it goes back to the prescription medication that's available and the number of people being put on them. But that's certainly a problem, and in 50% of the deaths, or over half of them, that it was heroin. One of the things, though, that we can't forget is that alcohol is a major, major problem, you know, and that you can see some of the statistics up there around alcohol. And one of the things that we're seeing, particularly with the younger population, is that many young people who have had opportunities to deal with either their prescription drug or their heroin problems are now going back to alcohol. And so, and they believe it's not really a problem. It's almost like they're finding it for the first time. And so I can't tell you how many, I met with the family several weeks ago whose son had a heroin overdose, or had a heroin overdose, was saved, was put on some drugs to help him deal with that. Buprenorphine was part of what he was looking at. He was also then was believed that he was still able to drink alcohol. So within a very short period of time, he died 3 weeks ago of an overdose. Having been through sort of what his family sort of sigh of relief that he was going to be fine because he was effectively dealing with his problem, but he was part of this generation that believed that alcohol was not going to cause him a problem. So a real problem out there, and some of the messaging we really need to take a look at, that alcohol still kills more people in this country than anyone else, than any other disease. This is really sensitive, so
It does.
yeah.
If you look
So,
at it, it'll probably change.
you know, so why do we have this problem? And whenever, you know, we have had times in history where there has been big insurgence of addiction and then having drops of addiction. So if you take a public health model and take a look at why is that happening, you know, we always look at the three kinds of things that come together. And one of them is availability of the substance, and I already talked a little bit about the availability in this area of heroin and all kinds of drugs. We did a test with a group of kids in Philadelphia and said, you know, if you, and they were in that 9 to 11 age, if you wanted to buy drugs, where would you buy them? And they all said, oh, we'd go, and they all pointed where they would go and be able to buy the drugs with no problem at all. So availability is something that we certainly have a lot of easy access to it, and most schools, kids in our schools know where they can buy drugs if they chose to buy drugs. The susceptible host is the other piece of it, people who are either genetically predisposed to addiction. We know that addiction runs in families. We know that there's an intergenerational transmission of this disease, but we also know that there are lots of other triggers that begin to set people up for addiction and make a larger part of our population susceptible hosts. Some of it is that we are so connected to electronics right now that we're not developing a lot of interpersonal relationship skills. We're not doing a lot of problem solving, you know, through our youth. And so we're really creating a generation that is at high risk for technology addiction, but, you know, all of the other things that kind of go along with that, the way their endorphins are responding to some of the electronic things that they're doing, that's why they're getting their highs, and it's very easy for that high seeking to move into, you know, a lot of other substances. So we have people who have not had that positive life experience. We have people using drugs earlier and earlier. Each generation we seem to have that onset go down earlier and earlier, and all of a sudden there's this magic elixir that says, you know, life is better. I've never felt so good. Or I've had people say, I felt complete. I felt like all of a sudden, you know, things were going to go right. Unfortunately, what happens is as the drugs go on, they stop getting that out of it and they start using to feel normal. So there's a big problem of that. And then the other is our supporting environment. And our supporting environment is we have really become a society that believes in better living through chemistry. I always pick out some of the commercials on television that says, you know, there's one about a plumbing company that says, you know, if you've got a plumbing problem, you should take this drug to solve your problem. And I thought, I'd call a plumber. But it's crazy. So we've become this whole thing of, you know, needing to have something outside of ourselves to solve some of the problems in our life. So here you have some examples of what I've just said about that early use, the high tolerance. We also congratulate people that can drink a lot. In my own experience, I was somebody who could drink like a lady. You know, what the heck does that mean? But I could hold a great deal of alcohol. I have a family history of addiction, but I could drink a whole lot. At 18, I could drink probably most of the men under the table. I had a very high tolerance, and it's that high tolerance that allows you to continue in your addiction. So that's all part of it. I now know that high tolerance to other drugs, so even to today, if I go under anesthesia, the person who is giving me anesthesia needs to know that it takes a lot to get me out because I have this very high tolerance. That means that I can use a lot for a while. And so that's one of the things that, we say, isn't that wonderful? They can drink a lot or they can use a lot. They don't seem to have any problems with it. And it's all that insidiousness that kind of is going into the forerunners of addiction that's happening. We have easier methods of administration. Smoking, injecting drug may increase the addiction potential. It goes to my brain quicker. So I get that high quicker than what I would need otherwise. So that's another one of those things. And we have a lot of self-medicating issues. We have a lot of kids who are on ADHD medication, which sets that there's something outside of me that can control me or that can help me. And then I need to, many times recently, we were starting to take kids off of that medication in adolescence at the same time they were now being accessed to a lot of other drugs, so that was also problematic. So, I said we're a society that believes in better living through chemistry. The two largest populations, and this is one of the things that people don't always really recognize, is the under 21 and the over 60. And some of them have some very unique similarities. Some of our over 60. So, why would the over 60 population be at as high risk or be the growing population? Somebody have an idea? Yeah.
Physicians are prescribing more medications for them.
That's one
and
of them.
The interaction between the medications as
interaction. And I used to always have this, and now I've got all these other medications, and I don't always know that interaction. That's one of them.
Depression.
For
older people.
Approaching retirement.
Life change.
Yeah.
And the life change, and also there's that sense that now I can sort of do what I want to do, but I don't know what that is. And not only that, there's many times people are moving to new over 55 communities. My sister lives in one, and every single activity is alcohol related. So we have people on all of these medications, and maybe they would not have in their other, wherever they lived in their other neighborhood, not done that, but now they're having new relationships, much like our under 21. We're now having those kind of lifestyle changes or life moods. So we've got a serious problem with the over 60 population. And unfortunately, a lot of times we believe it's dementia. And we think, they're just forgetting or they're just doing that. And what we have found is many times when people are taken off a lot of these drugs, it's not dementia. I mean, they're able to regain a much higher quality of life. So something to keep in mind. Here are some signs, the loss of motivation, loss of memory, family and marital discord, the sleeping disorder, the drug-seeking behavior, and the doctor shopping. If you have somebody who all of a sudden wants to keep changing their doctors or moving from doctor to doctor to doctor, a lot of the problem is that, I'm not getting what I need from one doctor, and I've talked to a lot of pain management doctors who have really tried very hard to help people manage, and what they say is I lose a lot of patients that way because they want me to prescribe something. They want me to do that. So if you're looking at this, and I want to make sure we have time to keep looking at the church's piece, but it's a good foundation to understand. Harvard says that there are 4 things to look at: cravings, compulsion, consequences, and control. So ultimately you lose control, but there is a process of trying to hold on to that control. And I may have suffered lots and lots of consequences. This young man, it's his 4th arrest in the past 5 months. His last one was for buying from a undercover police officer, buying drugs. But those natural consequences, but he really believes it's no big deal. And some of what's happening is other people are helping him believe it's no big deal. Everybody, of course, gets arrested 4 times in 5 months. And what happens is that we begin to get this craving and the compulsion. That compulsion I will come back to when we talk about recovery. So here are just some questions, and you'll have them just to take a look at. And one of the things that I think is important is, does it cause me to pull away from God for this congregation? Because lots of times that's part of the process. Part of it is shame and guilt are major components of addiction, and I get, a great deal, particularly if I've had a faith growing up and history, I feel it even more. And so I don't want to be reminded of that, and I start separating myself from anything that's going to take a look at that. I have people who tell me when they see a commercial on television about a treatment center or about something, they have to shut it off because it makes them feel so guilty. Going to church does the same thing for some people. So one of the things that in the past 18 years, we really had a shift in what we're looking at. We now start looking at things through a recovery lens instead of through an addiction lens. Up until that point, a lot of work had been done, and a lot of science and research had always been done on people who were in active addiction. Finally, we started looking at, what about people in long-term recovery, and what do we know about recovery? And so it's that shift in looking at things through a recovery lens. So this is your brain, and this is your normal brain up top, and I always qualify that with, I'm not so sure what a normal brain is, but this is your normal, this is your brain, and the yellow stuff is all the good stuff that keeps, our synapse going and all of our things happening really good. And then your middle level is your cocaine abuser after 10 days of abstinence. So if you look at the lack of activity there for someone who has been using cocaine for quite a myriad of time, and this could be substitute whatever drug you want. It's just, so for a cocaine abuser after 10 days of abstinence, we wonder why people aren't making good decisions. And the first thing that happens is the first part of your brain that's affected is your ability to make good decisions and your compulsive, and your ability to control your compulsions. So your compulsive behavior and all is what kind of is escalating. So at 10 days of abstinence, we're clearly not functioning at a level where we can make good decisions or we can control our compulsions. And what is significant in this is that this is 100 days of someone who has been abstinent from cocaine. And if you see, so this is the good news of recovery, that the yellow stuff is coming back. So it's visible evidence that people do recover and can, our brain up until a point has remarkable recovery capabilities. But if you look at that at 100 days, it's not back yet. And one of the things that, AA has said for years and years, don't make any big decisions for a year. And yet a lot of our criminal justice systems, our treatment systems, our families believe that we have sent somebody away to treatment, they're fixed, and they're supposed to be all better, and why aren't they acting better? Or why are they still doing these foolish things? And so this is just a reminder to let you know that people many times aren't capable of doing that. And so what happens is many times people are in this chronically relapsing thing. Chronically relapsing condition is one of the things that has really been promoted much more in the past few years. I didn't know that I had an option to relapse. Going into treatment, I really didn't. I didn't know that that was something back then, that I was supposed to do the work I needed to do to sustain my recovery. And then we began to kind of change some of that and really understood, and that's good because we began to understand that relapse could be a possibility, but it shouldn't be an expectation. And so for some, I've had families who have said, the counselor said to me, when he relapses. And I say, wait a minute, don't set that up. Don't set that up as an expectation. So one of the things when you start looking at things through a recovery lens, what you find is that this is an old deal about how many people relapse and what the length of their time, the frequency of their relapse. What's astounding about this is that 50% reported 4 abstinence period followed by a return to addiction, and those abstinence periods were at least a month. So when you start looking at things through a recovery lens, instead of saying, oh, you relapsed, you say, how did you sustain? If you understand what's really going on in somebody's brain, congratulations, how did you stay abstinent for a month? Or how did you do that? What are the kinds of things you did? And how can we help you do more? Or what was working for you? Instead of that well, you fell off the wagon. So we have all kinds of pejoratives that we talk about for people who are relapsing when it takes a great deal of strength. If you think about my decision making and my ability, my brain is not functioning well. If I was able to stay abstinent for a period of time, that should be something that we should be able to work with, and many times we don't. So there's been a lot of work in SAMHSA. I think it is fascinating. Before the year 2000, the word recovery was not in any of our public health lexicons. We didn't talk about the word, and SAMHSA never used the word recovery. So they never had, SAMHSA is the National Center for Addiction Research, and never had the word recovery as part of it. So they have now shifted that and are doing a lot of work and a lot of research around recovery. So Nora Volker is the head of SAMHSA's research and the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And what she says is, I've seen all too often how the cycle of relapse and the shame and self-disappointment this disease produces can rob a person of hope and even, in extreme cases, the will to continue living. This young man that just overdosed a few weeks ago, he really was so enmeshed in his shame and his guilt that I believe he took his own life. He overdosed, but I think he purposefully did that because he couldn't handle this anymore. And so here's some good news, and is that if we can, while we have a disease that has horrendous potential outcomes, it also has a potential recovery rate. If from 1 to 12 months, if someone can stay abstinent, you have a 36% chance of getting another year of abstinence. If you can stay 1 to 3 years, it's 66%. And at 4 to 7 years, you have an 86% chance of lifelong recovery. If you look at other chronic illnesses, hypertension, asthma, diabetes, you don't have anywhere near that kind of possibility. So we should be putting our efforts, everybody together, in trying to figure out how we can help people sustain that and support recovery in order to be able to help people and communities really begin to change the percentages that we have out there. Lots of times we don't do that. So this is just another quote. I don't need to read it to you, but part of what she's talking about here is just reinforcing what I've said, is that their brains are compromised until they have time to heal. And so it's a healing process. And I think churches are really good at helping people through the healing process. So this healing process is what most people, the desire to be rid of the drug and its destructive influences on their life and health relationship is usually quite sincere. People really usually want to do that, they just don't know how to do that. And when you have that decision making and the impulse control, if my automatic impulse is to take something, and I've had years of doing that, it's not so easy to automatically then stop that without a lot of support around us. And what many times happens is people have either 30 days or now some treatment processes are 14 days, and then you're out. And it's, go forth, and we say we graduated. Well, I don't know what that means. Graduated sort of means that you're out the end of the process and you're really not. So making sure that people have a recovery plan, they know what they need to do, and they have the support to implement it. Lots of times there are lots of barriers along the way to being able to do that. And so this is just the head of SAMHSA, Wesley Clark, says that treatment's only part of recovery, but it's not equal to recovery. Recovery is the much larger construct. The goal of treatment is the absence of symptoms, so we stabilize people in treatment. If you think about other diseases, we hospitalize somebody in order to get them stable with their diabetes medicine or hypertension or asthma and all of that. But then it has a life behavioral kind of component to it. This disease is also, so we're looking at the much more holistic health piece of it. Treatment alone doesn't address the other challenges, and recovery is different for each person. So we have also gotten stuck with things like my way or the highway, this is what you need to do. And what we've learned is that there are some things that have worked for a large population, but there are some other things that may indeed work for people who have struggled. I have a center in Philadelphia, which is at 17th and Lehigh. We're in the hood. And everybody that I see there has been pretty much a traditional treatment center and a traditional 12-step program failure. They have believed that recovery is not for them. I mean, many of them are street people, most of them have been homeless at some point, and have lost a lot of hope. And they come into the center, and when they find out that there are other things that they might be able to try, so you can almost see their whole body, see like, oh, there's something else I could do. And there's people who will help me maybe try to do that. So having a broader lens of some of the things, and many of them, we now have a church service at our center, which is recovery focused on Sundays, because some of the churches around the area were not particularly recovery friendly. And so that's a piece of it. So these are just some of the key principles about recovery. You can take a look at that. This really does go quick. Yeah. So here are some of those essential agreement things. So someone who is struggling where to live every day, or we have lots of people who've been couch surfing here in Bucks County. We seem to think there isn't such a big homeless population. There is a homeless population, but we also have a lot of people who are no longer welcome in their own homes. And so they are living on other people's couches, particularly in that under 24 population, and they're doing all of those things. So having and trying to figure out where I'm going to do that every night is a real problem. And so sometimes takes priority over trying to figure out how I'm going to sustain recovery. And that kind of goes away on the wayside. Getting employment and job readiness, and yet we have a criminal justice system that many of our people who are using drugs and alcohol are also embedded in the criminal justice system, and it becomes a real barrier for them to get a job or to sustain a job when I have to do all of the kinds of things that I need to do in order, if I'm on drug court, I have a pretty busy schedule, and if I have to maintain a job at the same time, it's very difficult to do that. So we need employers who are willing to help and support people to be able to allow that to happen. We also need job readiness kinds of training. Part of what we do, we have a recovery center in Doylestown in Bristol, and part of what we do is help people to practice how are they going to talk about this long gap they've had in their employment. How do I write a resume? One of the things we found is that in the past few years, a lot of job seeking has become internet based. And if I don't have access to an internet, or I don't have an email address, how am I going to be able to apply for a job? Or how am I going to get a call? How am I going to do that? So some of the barriers. The life and recovery skills, health and wellness. Many times I have all kinds of physical things going on. Our women's center, many of the women have not had a physical exam in years. And all of a sudden now, if they begin to access healthcare kinds of things, problems that they've had brewing for a long time are certainly out there. I mean, they've had them, but now they're aware of them. So all of these kinds of things. And the last, that sense of belonging and purpose. I think a community of faith can be a huge asset in trying to help people, create that sense of belonging, by being welcomed. And so let me move into that whole piece. So what we know is that what's needed before people can develop motivation sometimes is a sense of hope, that they don't need more pain. Yet lots of times what we have been working on and doing is, implementing much, much more pain instead of really creating some hope. And as I said, we have a center in Philadelphia that I can't tell you the things that continually that I hear, that I think, I don't know how much more pain these people can experience. I really don't. The level of difficulties that they have experienced, what they really need is not more pain in their life. They need some hope that they're going to be able to move forward, and that there is some kind of opportunity and chance for them. So recovery is a process, and addiction is a spiritual as well as physical and psychological problem. Some people talk about addiction as being a hole in your soul, and if you don't have one before, you begin to get a hole in your soul, and you really much more disassociate with anything that is. So over the years, we have looked at, and members of the faith community as well as the community at large, has looked at drug addiction one or two ways. We either look at it as somebody who's sick with compassion. We have a big onset of availability of treatment and resources, and we look at the person who has an addiction problem as being a victim. This is not new. Benjamin Rush, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, was a Philadelphia physician, really mapped out this back when he was signing the Declaration of Independence, talked about this. And at that time, there was a real push to try to have some kind of support for people who could not regulate their use of alcohol. Mostly it was at that time because we didn't have the plethora of other drugs. But so the other side of it, and the other way that pendulum swings, is that we look at the person as a criminal with stigma. We have high stigma. I have a button to erase stigma. People are the solution. Instead of sending them to treatment, is to sending them to jail, and we look at the person as a social deviant. And as I said, we have gone, as a culture, we have swung back and forth many times. This is an example. Working in this field for a long time, I sort of got to a point of believing that stigma was just something that was always there. And that, of course, that's how this happened as a reaction of some of the behaviors of people that have addiction. There's a real sense in the culture of stigma. I didn't, until I started doing research, realize this, how we have not always had that, and some examples of this. So this is just an example of women back in the 1800s. I usually say to a group, when do you think the first women's treatment center was? And people usually will say, oh, probably in the 70s, 1970s or something like that. Well, we had a growth of women's treatment centers back in 1890, in the 1800s. And in the 1800s, if you look at this picture, for me, it's the antithesis of stigma. And it's showing how the culture really looked at this. These are women who posed for a picture in their newspaper. It was front page of the newspaper. And they posed as graduates of this treatment center. They were part of the alumni group. So what we see here is they have their children there. They have flowers. They have the American flag behind them. Very different than, sort of where we have gone. But for me, it's just an example how the culture can very much treat the problem of addiction differently if we chose to. So one of the things that we need to do is strike this balance. The stopping, enabling, and allowing consequences to happen is sort of where we have been, and the natural consequences, we have this very big criminal justice construct at times. And then positive reinforcement, I mentioned, wow, you've been a month, you've been able to sustain recovery, how'd you do it? Is sort of that positive reinforcement, or, oh, you were able to do this, that's great. And then the safety concerns with that. What are the safety concerns? The man that I'm going to go do an intervention with is driving his car under the influence. Their concern is what's going to happen if he leaves their house under the influence and kills somebody. And a very real, so how do you balance those kinds of concerns? I have information there about overdose. One of the members of this intervention team saved his granddaughter, who overdosed at his house, but had Narcan available. And so the flyer there is about if you know somebody who has an addiction and is using opioids, it's really helpful to understand how you can do it. And in Pennsylvania now, there is a prescription available to everybody if you want to have it. This man happened to have saved his granddaughter's life because he had access to it. And so there's, always never say never. Be prepared. And so the faith community has a special opportunity to invite those overwhelmed by the impact of addiction to accept the loving support and encouragement within the faith community. There are some important reasons for churches to be more intentionally engaged in supporting addiction recovery, and I'm having met with your team here a couple of times now, and I'm really excited that churches really are looking for how can we be able to do that. And so, many people, addiction is a spiritual as well as psychological problem, a physical problem. It provides a profound dependence that comes between a person and their ultimate response to the love of God and neighbor. So my life narrows so much, but it also becomes a huge barrier for everybody. And it separates and often arises out of a separation of my true self. I always have people compare and contrast who was this person and who are they now on drugs. And it's usually, of the significant others and purpose and values that give life meaning and fullness. And the evidence shows that recovery is more likely to be sustained where there is spiritual dimensions are addressed. So we now have some research with people who have been able to sustain recovery and people who have sustained recovery who had a connection with a faith community, had a better prognosis or had a better opportunity and statistically have been able to sustain their recovery longer. So some of the considerations is to make sure you're understanding that if you have the understanding that this is a disease, we need to start treating it like that. So what does that mean? What does that mean with how you treat other diseases within your congregation? People who are ill with other things, is there sort of a standard process that you do? And then how do you do that with this population? Are you some people have this them. I remember early on when I started working in this field, and I was not sharing at that point that I was a person in recovery. And I remember sitting in a room and having them talk about them, and all of a sudden that light went on that I was a them, and that they were talking about, and it was like, oh, okay, so, this is not a bad person, it's a person who has a terrible disease that has taken over their life. And, so how do we help a sick person get well should be the construct it's coming from. Understand that the disease has a behavioral element rooted in the loss of control and social judgment. Understand that sin exists in the lives of alcoholics and addicts just as it does in anybody else. We are all sinners. And that it's rather often a behavioral element of the disease, and the disease process often causes, and this again is that shame and guilt, and it just compounds itself. So stigma is the other thing. It's a spiritual problem. Jesus' ministry of healing is often focused on those who treated as unclean and unworthy, and we have a whole population of people who are treated as unclean and unworthy. And stigma is a form of spiritual distancing and violence towards others with whom we fear to acknowledge our common humanity. And I really like this definition of stigma. I think it helps us sort of get our head around it a little bit. This whole non-judgmental approach, one of the things that happens as addiction progresses is that we become more and more sensitive to things that are going to allow us to continue our addiction. And that sensitivity almost allows us to smell what you're thinking. So if I think you're really a bad person, I'm going to know that. I am acutely aware of judgmental activities to me. And so that judgmental, that already knowing, and I'm already judging myself, when I come in contact with other people that are judging me, my barriers go up, and I'm not going to be receptive to anything that's coming from that person. Understand that the disease has caused bankruptcy of the spirit, an alienation of God, church and community, and the spiritual isolation that requires the effort to overcome. It's not easy, and we talk about people in early recovery being in spiritual kindergarten. And so being able to really start looking at how would we almost look at, we're dealing with our faith, sharing our faith with our young people and our kindergartners. Sometimes it is Jesus loves me, this I know. It is the very, very basic kinds of response. We're often very angry at God. We thought God didn't fix us, and that it comes to terms with that anger and find a God of their understanding. The faith community can be there to help with that understanding. The church is often sought as a first responder, so you have people who will come to particularly families, and so one of the things that you're going to be looking at is the role that the church can outreach to families, because many times people have been, we talk about families being 5 to 7 years before they get to a point where they realize that addiction is a problem. You keep hoping that there's something else going on. You know, we keep looking at there's some other problem, and if we fix that problem, this will stop and all. But families are going through incredible stress with all of this. And so you have a quote about bringing it into the light, bringing that shame into the light, and I meant to find it before I came. But I think that just by hosting a family education program around addiction helps bring it into the light. So you know, that whole thing that if my church, you know, has this, maybe I can begin to work on it. Maybe it is a problem that I can begin to deal with. You know, there's safety. You know, often churches are a sanctuary. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is our children. There's some statistics that 1 in 4 children are living in a household where addiction is present. And so some of those children are in your Sunday schools. And, you know, are they coming to your Sunday schools? I did a program like this in another church a while ago, and there was a woman there who was probably in her 70s, and she talked about, when we went around sort of, why are you there? And she said, because I grew up with an alcoholic father. And she said, I can't tell you the scars that left me with, but she said, I wish the church had been there for me. I wish I could have had that sanctuary as a little kid. So we need to be looking at, as we're looking at programming, what are we doing for children who are living within homes? And that whole sanctuary is one of the things to consider. Can we take this trust seriously by considering what it really means to provide sanctuary to troubled people and families? So learning, if you are choosing to do something around children, what are the things that are helpful to children, you know, that are living in this kind of thing? It's a whole nother thing to happen, but it's another whole piece that you can use ministry to, or can expand ministry to have. And can we take this trust seriously, assuring that it is kept and not broken? People who are in, families and individuals who are mired in addiction have a very low trust level that people are going to follow through with what they say they're going to follow through with. Because an awful lot of people have left them down many times for very appropriate reasons. So gaining that trust, you never ever say something that you're going to do if you aren't going to do it. And so it's really helpful to keep that in mind. Churches are critical partners. People of faith should be on committees, task forces, all of those things that are going on in the community. There's a whole lot of work around making recovery-oriented communities and systems of care. And so there's lots of things going on in the communities that people of faith can be part of. Here are some other important ways that we can be intentionally engaged. That kind of openness, the welcoming, the friendly, you know, making sure you're reaching out to people and inviting them to things. Community meals, lots of work you're already doing, you know, is a really good way to invite people in. Movie night, you know, it's really hard early in recovery to go to some place that is safe and drug-free. So having activities that people are invited to with intentionality can be really helpful. And, you know, can we truly welcome talking and learning about uncomfortable topics like this? So, you know, this is a 1-hour presentation. This is a complex problem that has lots and lots of layers to it, but there's lots of ways that you can get more information. There's great reading, there's great movies. One of the things that you can do is host a movie on addiction and recovery to have the community see that you are open to the issue. That whole partnership more, you know, are we willing to step up in other ways? Can we only play our role well by learning to partner with others in the other communities in the participant being? I can't tell you how many task forces I have been on that no one has been on representing the faith community. And some of that is the timing of all of that, but so then somebody needs to say, we need to change the time. You know, don't just say, nobody from the faith community is here. We need to make it available and when they can. that whole awareness, looking at more knowledge, the recovery and resiliency. Recovery is a learning process. I am not automatically cured, and I will have steps and starts along the way, and I need to help people, be there for them during that resiliency time, or that resiliency building, and how the church can help get people back on the road, is an important thing. What is our response if someone does relapse? How do we help them, or do we shun them? And lots of times that is what we do. But other times we are very open in outreach and try to help people kind of get back on track. There are public policy issues that are very important. The whole issues around employment, I talked about that. The criminal justice system, we've had a war on drugs, it's been a dismal failure. And we have mass incarceration that is not working and is really a huge detriment to people who are trying to get their lives back together. Having a criminal record does harm people's employment possibilities and lots of other things. I have a 75-year-old man who can't get supportive housing because at 35 he had a criminal record. And the whole access to health care, making sure we're improving. So being available and being, signing petitions, doing whatever kinds of things you can do, walking to support recovery, doing all kinds of things. So I always like this as a reminder, my dear children, I write this to you so that you will not sin, but if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous one, together striving to keep his commandments, but knowing that Jesus already paid the price for our sins, we are forgiven. That's the message that many times people in recovery need to hear, and they need to not just hear it, they need to feel it. And I think people of faith are the people who can share it. And this is just kind of supporting, again, the whole idea of what are we doing with our Sunday schools and what are we doing with our children. That this is a quote that I found. My father was a leading attorney in the state. He was respected by everyone. He was president of the church council, was there when the church community needed him. My family had every material thing that we needed. My father was an alcoholic, and my father continues to bear the scars. So there are lots of ways that we can help mitigate some of the concerns and some of the things that are struggling with addiction, and kind of make life much more real and resilient for some of the children that we're working with, but also when individuals recover, families recover too, and communities recover, and we all benefit from that. So my parting is always that addiction is certainly worth the investment. Recovery is worth the investment. Addiction takes a huge toll on our community, but investing in recovery really does pay off. Okay, thank you. If you want to take advantage of it, you're going to do the pitch about volunteering.
Yeah, so first, Beverly, thank you so much, and God bless you as you go help the family right now. If you would like to become a volunteer working with our church, there will be a number of different opportunities, from becoming a mentor to come alongside of individuals or family members, becoming a facilitator to lead the PROAC Addiction Awareness Program, which will be coming this fall, to just being here to help serve coffee and welcome people. We are asking everyone who's interested to fill out a volunteer application. There's a number of those available right there. And we're having our first volunteer orientation.
Thank you.
Your memory sticks.
I got it. Yes.
It was just a
The first orientation will be held here in this room, Thompson Church, on Saturday, June the 4th, 2016, beginning at 9 o'clock in the morning. It's a 90-minute orientation from 9 until 10:30 here. If you are interested in becoming a volunteer, you do need to fill out an application. You can return it to me, and I'll make sure that it gets onto the folks at PROAC. There'll be much more information about the opportunities that will be available to you. Thank you.
Thank you.